I believe we'll get more people coming in, but the velocity kind of slowed down right there. So I guess we can go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Stevenson. I'm the planner in the Community Development Department. It's Community and Workforce Development at Pima County. And we've got some other planner staff people on here. And our consultant is Incremental Development Alliance, and they're working on a community development block grant funded activity in the city of South Tucson. They've been doing it for basically since the start of 2021. We got a couple speakers today. Neil Heller from Neighborhood Workshop. You can't hear me?
No, I can.
Okay, I'll get a little closer. And then we also have Brian Reilly, who is in New York, and they're also part of a couple other organizations. Brian used to be the economic development director in a couple different cities. They can tell you more about that if you're interested, but they're here to talk about what they've been up to, speaking with constituents and stakeholders in the city of South Tucson. So I will let them go ahead and get started. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. So I have a question for everybody who's on the Zoom. How many of you have been to one of the events that Ryan talked about in the last 6 months with us, whether that be a lecture or a presentation? Maybe you could just go to the Zoom chat and stick a number 1 in the chat. I'm just interested to see whether this is your first time or you've done this before. And throughout the presentation, we're going to ask you to put some notes like that in the chat, just so we get a sense of where people are, because this really is an opportunity for us to reflect on 6 months of work with the idea that you, the local folks, are going to be deciding what to take forward and what to move on. And so having a sense of who's interested in what, who cares about what, will help everybody see where the energy is and who you might have something in common with. So we'll use the chat function. And when you record these Zooms, it's easy to go back and look at those things as well. So it helps people in the future see what you said. Oh, I'm interested in this. I participated in this. So that's why we'll do it. We'll also spend most of our time today talking, listening to your reactions. But first, we wanted to give you a sense of, well, what have we all been doing and learning together over the last 6 months? So maybe 30 minutes of presentation and as long as an hour if you want to talk about your reactions, your next steps, your questions, your ideas, and for you to talk with each other, because we're at the end of our work with you and you all live in South Tucson and want to keep it going and build on what we've started and learned together. So what we thought we would do is give you an overview of what has happened in the last 6 months so that everybody's at the same page. If you participated in a lecture or you were on one of the Zoom calls that looked at one of our reports, we're going to touch on each one of those so that everybody has as much information as everybody else as you think about going forward. You have all the pieces. And we will share a link where you can go to any of these detailed documents that we refer to if you want to dig deeper and find out what it says. I'll share that link in a few minutes. So I will share my screen and Neil and I will trade off presenting what we have done. Feel free to, we'll also get into a discussion as much as you like. So, Ryan, could you enable me to share screen? So this is a final report out of our work from the Incremental Development Alliance in what I call the highlights for local champions. All of you are local champions who are going to hopefully take at least one piece or more of these ideas and move it forward to meet your community goals. So what we did and what's next for you. The work that we did we want to talk a little bit, as I said, to bring you all up to the same page here about what is incremental development very briefly. And raise the question that, what are you trying to achieve with it? Many of the folks we've worked with were staff planners for South Tucson and Pima County, and they had some ideas about what they thought incremental development, development could do for their work. And then Selena is an example of a small developer or an aspiring small developer who's being trained in a city, in a boot camp. The Incremental Development Alliance is also organizing them in the next, I think, 4 more weeks, training local folks and regional folks on how to do this. So you need to think about a little bit as we go through the presentation is, what are you trying to achieve with incremental development? What is incremental development? Our experience, we'll describe some of our experience around the country and some of the conclusions we've come to about what it is. And we'll share also what we know about it from that experience in dozens of cities and 5,000 small developers who've been trained by the Alliance. So we'll share some national perspectives, and we'll also point out that we've looked at and talked with a lot of local folks. So we'll share what we learned from that. In particular, we looked at what your current systems produce, right? Your zoning, your regulation, what kind of buildings are you producing based on the systems you have in place? How things work here. We looked at what is there a demand for, both residential and commercial. What's legal? We found plenty of things that exist in South Tucson, some of the things that you actually love that are actually surprisingly not legal. So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about what fits on the kind of property sizes that you have and the orientations. And how do you, what kind of buildings don't lose money? For example, Selena, I think you're probably learning in the training for small developers that the goal is at least not to lose money, right? So what kind of development pencils? We call it penciling, right? Does it turn into a cash flow that's positive? So we found that in a few places, when you mash all of those things up, that you are close to achieving some of your community goals, whether that be community wealth building and invigorating the retail environment on South 4th. But there's a few more things left to do to really enable the kind of development that you want to see. So we'll go into those details about what we learned. And then finally, at the very bottom of the screen, we have a link to all the documents that we're talking about. We're happy to host them there until local folks get a website up where this stuff can rest for the future. So a little bit about what is incremental development. We found that it's really focused on real estate that's built, owned, and maintained by local people, because that's the kind of real estate that generates more local benefits. And we talked about that in a number of our report outs. And that has been a theme with many of you about wanting to have more local benefits and how can local folks generate those through real estate strategies. And the trick is to lower the bar to entry of those kinds of development. So the theme of what we have been doing in the last 6 months is, how do we lower the bar so more local people can take advantage of real estate strategies and the benefits that real estate development, small scale real estate development, generates? And this picture is to point out that this is how we've been developing in the Southwest for several thousand years, and how humans have been developing for longer. The picture here shows us what we looked at in one of our lectures, that in Arizona, towns have been built around squares. So that the form of the built environment is not new, and it is what creates value. And we'll talk about some of the things that have changed since these places have been built and South Tucson's been built, that kind of work against that and what you can do about it. More contemporarily, this looks like what we have talked about as the missing middle of housing, right? Everything in the middle between single family homes and large multi-story projects that have multiple layers of finance. You have the things that you would see in every South Tucson neighborhood before World War I. Duplexes, tries, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, this range of things that have been missing since about after World War I, right? So we wanted to enable some of these buildings, many of which, exist and are quite useful. How do we make more of those? How do we make those legal? And to point out pictures that you already have this, and we're trying to grow more of it. We focused on two types of development: residential at the top, so you see that continuum here, and commercial at the bottom, where the increment doesn't even have to be a building. It could start out as an increment involving tents or food trucks or trailers. And the idea here too is to create economic opportunity for folks with buildings, but maybe even before buildings. So we looked at both residential and commercial incremental opportunities. One thing to focus on, this graph needs a little explaining, but on the left and the right, we have small scale and incremental development. And on the right, we have large and master plan developments. We've talked about some of the large master plan developments that are happening in South Tucson and near South Tucson. And we've spent a lot of time talking about small. When you look at top to bottom, there's two kinds of money. There is corporate and institutional money, and there's entrepreneurial and bootstrap, right? Local money. The kind of opportunities we've been focused on is where small scale development intersects with the kind of money that is local, right? So this is where we've been looking for opportunities with the work we've been doing. So what did we look at? Neil calls these diagrams sugar cubes. And what a lot of his work involved was looking at what would fit on particular properties, right? Your typical 50 by 100, 150 foot lot in South Tucson. And his analysis and numbers come from this modeling. We had two tasks as part of our work in the last 6 months. The first one was to do a clinic to enable more incremental development. And we generated a summary memo for focus groups from different kinds of folks. We talked to local developers, local staff, planning, economic community development people, nonprofit developers, local finance folks, the range, and we put those findings in a summary memo that's going to be part of that link that I shared with you. And then the second task was to do a diagnostic. What would it take to enable more incremental development? So this was a series of lectures that talked about incremental and small scale development. It was a fireside chat with Monty, one of the co-founders, who's also teaching the Small Developer Bootcamp. And these lectures are going to be in that file as well. Ryan recorded them. But the thing we want to talk a lot about today, just to give you a sense of what we learned, is the spot test of what your current regulations are allowing and preventing. Because this is what you get. The reason South Tucson looks like South Tucson is largely because of the rules and regulations that you have in place that govern the built environment. So how might you use real estate as a strategy then for some of your broader goals? And that would be something to think about in this conversation today is, well, why do you care about this? What are you hoping to achieve through looking at small scale real estate strategies? Topics have included things like intergenerational wealth building, invigorating commercial districts, diversifying housing options. So we'll want to talk more about that after we share what we learned. And finally, we've talked with the staff of both jurisdictions and said, a final report that you typically get from consultants sits on a shelf. We're going to give you this PowerPoint so that you can make parts of this presentation to the next set of people that you need to enlist in your efforts. And we'll talk more about that. So today we've got a bunch of people, some of whom have been with us, and some people who are new. Part of your challenge locally is to keep growing the circle of folks in South Tucson who are aware of and want to work on the issues that you want to work on through small scale development strategies. So the PowerPoint is a way to help bring them into the conversation just like we're doing today. So let's take a look at what your current regulatory system produces, right? You've got regulations, mostly zoning, permitting, and other things, and they're producing certain types of buildings in South Tucson right now while we sit here. This is a map that shows in dark blue all the land that's zoned single family residence. It's called SR1, right? So if you go in these streets, you're going to see almost exclusively single family homes. Now, you may find some stuff from before zoning was enacted. I think in 1978, your zoning made this map. So you may find that missing middle that was built before 1978. But from today on, from 1978 on, all you could build in the blue areas is a single family home. So we're going to want to look at, well, what does that preclude you from doing? What opportunities might you have if you would consider changing that, like lots of communities around the country are doing? I don't know if you've heard, but the idea of single family zoning is something that people are looking at changing. And Neil was involved in the first city that made that change, Portland. And he can talk about why they did it and what they were trying to achieve. Some of their goals in Portland are similar to some of your goals. So you may consider, and we're going to make some recommendations about looking at single family zoning and maybe changing that. One of the things that we learned was the bar graph shows all your single family zoned properties by size. Smaller properties, less than 1,000 square feet on the left, larger properties all the way up to greater than 8,000 square feet on the right. So you've got single family zone parcels, from 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 square foot in size. But what's circled, 19% of those properties of all of your single family zoning, all that stuff in dark blue, is what we call non-conforming. Essentially, it is illegal to rebuild today, right? So one of your challenges is you have a built environment that says single family zoning, but the built environment is different than what the regulations allow, right? And that mismatch is something that we want to look at. We also did two market studies. So we tried to understand, well, what is their demand for in residential properties? And the bar graph here shows highlights from that target market analysis, the kinds of buildings and the kinds of rent levels that people are looking for in South Tucson. So there is demand, and you'll notice that, at the most of the demand is kind of between about $800 a month and maybe $500 a month, right? So rents in that range are in high demand, and you've got fewer folks that are looking for properties with higher rents, up to $1,400 a month. Maybe 4 people in a year will look for a property at $1,400 per month. Whereas down in the lower levels, there are many more folks. But this is the demand that you are thinking about trying to capture when a small developer is rehabbing or building a building. And these are the kinds of buildings that we identified as being in demand: the duplex, the apartment house, et cetera. These are part of that missing middle. And we did a presentation. Incremental Development Alliance has a whole classification system for that missing middle called step buildings. So these are, if they look familiar, they're from that 52 or so particular types of buildings in that missing middle. So we identified what there's a demand for on the residential side. And we also looked at the commercial side, the retail side. And the point here in the bold is that there were some gaps in your retail offerings. So ready to assemble furniture and furniture restoration and toys and games, these were retail gaps. There's other information in the commercial market analysis, but this gives folks who are starting a business or somebody who wants to make space available to a business, the kind of businesses that South Tucson doesn't have. And instead of going to Tucson or farther away, you might be able to get a business like that thriving and serving local needs. But again, we also pointed out that it's not only the bricks and mortar kind of businesses, but there are opportunities lower in the spectrum for temporary and mobile types of uses, until you get enough demand for a brick and mortar building. So the second task that we undertook was this diagnostic of how do we enable more incremental development in South Tucson. And after we learned how the system works through our interviews and our focus groups, we worked with staff to take 3 shots. Your zoning is a big, old, complicated. How many pages is your zoning regulation, Mick? Probably close to 100. We took 3 darts and tried to understand more specifically with some of the kind of properties that staff felt were either available, that you had a lot of, or, for example, in the live work idea, we talked with local artisans and retail owners, and they said, we need more places. We talk to folks all the time in our network who are looking for retail space, but they'd love to be able to live and work where they, so that they can save a little bit of money. They don't have to go away to work. And, so we looked at single family home zoning. Instead of a single family, we looked at a 4-unit on the same property. We looked at the live work opportunity. And then there were some larger properties, larger for small, right? Where you might be able to do like somewhere on 6th or somewhere on 4th, where you could do a combination of micro commercial and some living spaces on the same property. So these were 3 tests, and we ran them to see what we learned. And we want to share a little bit about that. I want to point out that what our tests ended up being is toward the higher end, the more intense end of these spectrums, right? So we did spot tests for new construction of the 4-plex, the live work. And you can see they're more intense than, say, a cottage, right? We looked at a 4-plex. The mixed use was more intense than a food truck court. And what we learned generally was that the cost to build new exceeded most people's willingness to pay that level of rent, right? So if the rents are too low to cover the cost of building, small developers and local folks are not going to be able to build it. It was good to find that out. And so then what we came to the conclusion was, let's look at the less intense end of the spectrum. Let's look at what is accessible to folks right now. And we found that rehabbing existing buildings and adding on an increment to an existing building were the kinds of small scale development that were accessible to locals right now. So we want to talk a little bit more about those numbers and what we found. But this is the general pattern. And with that, Neil describe some more spot test, real world examples and what we learned when we went deeper.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. I've had the pleasure of getting to know South Tucson and getting to spend some time rooting around in your zoning code, cruising the town on Google Maps, taking a peek, and learning a little bit more about how things have been developed. And it's really, I think y'all are in a really fascinating situation where the city is basically 1 mile by 1 mile, right? So it is a ped shed. What that means is you can walk within 5 or 10 minutes to anything you need. You can walk or bike, and so you have and you've got this nice grid of streets with alleys, which makes parking much easier, or trash pickup, things like that. So I think you've got a real opportunity to develop a really fascinating, compact community. But I like so Brian was talking about these prototypes that we ran through kind of a test, right? So we pretended, basically what the spot tests are for is to pretend that we are a small developer and we're gonna work in your town. And by doing this, we test things like what is legal now, and what does that get us? What's the path of least resistance? but also what if we modified some of the rules? What could we get away with, and how would that affect our development costs or the final sales price or rent costs? And so what you're seeing here is probably the most intense version of what we modeled. And what I modeled here was that live work micro commercial condo village. And so that the sugar cube on the right that you're seeing is 5 micro commercial spaces at the front of the lot with four for sale townhomes out back. What I found was that those came in, the commercial spaces did well, but the condos out back probably needed to sell for about $330,000, which we felt was really pushing the top of the market. But I think it's important to understand as we talk about these that, so there's, you know, institutional capital. So there are investment returns that are expected from these projects that would never consider these types of projects, right? So they're going to do the large master plan projects. And so if these can't pencil, then we know that those can't work as well, right? So we're moving down the spectrum from the institutional capital and the large master plan to the small scale infill, but we modeled new construction first. And we found that, you know, $1.5 million project on West, or is it East 29th, was going to probably be too complex and too expensive and be out of touch with the market to build on spec. So we learned that we should probably back off. And I found a building on that same street that probably fit that bill and modeled that, right? And so when you see you could do that for 1/3 of the cost, and that's probably more realistic and in line and more feasible for somebody local and with the current market conditions to make happen. So rather than go from 4 units for sale and 5 commercial buildings and have to get 5 commercial tenants, right? So we back that off, do a smaller scale commercial rehab and end up with 2 commercial buildings, maybe with a little bit of, well, yeah. And if you go back, you know, maybe within this space in the back, there's some living that's included, right? So, and so the way that this works, so maybe this works out to be like a live work duplex, living in the back, 2 units up front. And the commercial on this works out really well to rent out. In our conversations with local entrepreneurs, they stated that right now they're hard pressed to find commercial space that's $1,000 or less. And that's sort of the space that they were looking for. This accomplishes that. So we can get to those rates if we go smaller, but currently what does come on the market is much larger and it's very expensive and out of reach for small entrepreneurs. And so the reason that the commercial works so well in this project is that we are able to shrink the space. And so by shrinking the space, the price per square foot goes up, but the total overall cost to the commercial tenant goes down, right? And so if you ever consider Starbucks, right? So they've got, what is it? Tall grande venti. You know, have any of you ever done the per ounce calculation on your coffee? Or, you know, it's not a very common thing. I mean, so you just look at the final amount. Like, do I want to spend $3 or do I want to spend $5 or $8, right? So that's the calculation that these small entrepreneurs are looking at. And these came in at, you know, $1,000 or less and a little bit of live space in the back, which could maybe be rented. But something like this could also be done with like a home, like an owner occupied SBA loan. So you just got the small commercial renovation with living space in the back. There's more space in the rear of the lot for maybe further expansion of some cottage living space, but that could be further down the road. Okay, so if we go to the next slide.
You know, just to sum up, I don't know how you're feeling, but if you've just joined us, this might seem like an overwhelming amount of detail. But the point here is that properties like this are not going to magically be redeveloped by somebody that's outside of Tucson and the region. This is going to be a challenging property with a lot of, you know, a lot of manipulation financially and conceptually to try to get a configuration that's going to be able to work. So that's the kind of detail that Selena's learning in the boot camp. And this is what local small developers do. They take what looks like a problem property. It's very challenging. And we know that nobody else is going to look at this because in fact, it's too challenging. It's not the standard Starbucks that we plop down every city, and they have a formula and they can administer that from New York. This is the kind of property that in South Tucson is super specific to South Tucson, and you're going to need a local person to play with, renovating the commercial, adding some residential to get some rent, trying to do it all within the costs, the local construction costs. There are a lot of variables that go into this, but projects like this are doable. You have examples of success, and you want to be able to grow more of them. So that's why we looked at this opportunity and the others that Neil's going to describe.
Yep, so if we go to this slide, what we're finding is that there are a lot of things working against making development harder right now. We have really high construction costs. We have high land costs. And in the case of South Tucson, there's a challenge with achievable rents. And so trying to calibrate what kind of building types meet what people can pay, right? So we started with new construction on all of our spot tests, and we learned that new construction is really difficult. So we moved down the spectrum. We get smaller and smaller and more incremental, and we looked at renovations and rehabs. But even here, what you're seeing is, so you've got the main house in orange here, and then you've got that little green box, which is like a guest suite. So it might be in addition to the house, right? And that's probably the lowest increment of a residential scenario, right? So even building the new cottages in the back may end up being cost prohibitive. I think maybe, I was estimating you could build those for maybe $150,000 or right around there. But I'd say if somebody in the community had access to the trades and could get some cousins, or some friends to come over and help, that cost could come down, right? So I think that there's opportunity for that. And the trick is just to kind of make that possible. And as we mentioned, in 75% of your residential areas, this is not allowed. And so the people that live in those areas would not be able to do this. They'd have to live in a special SR2 zone. But anyway, so there's this scenario. And the guest suite is probably the easiest to build. So we're probably looking at a scenario where it's maybe a studio or a real small 1-bedroom just tacked on to the back of the house. Right. And so what we're trying to do is take the opposite approach from doing and exploring any kind of silver bullet to solve these affordability issues. In some locations, they do the silver bullet approach where they want to heavily subsidize, a big, large scale affordable housing project. And I'm not against those or anything, but that does not enlist the capabilities of local folks to get involved. And also there's a benefit to the local folks as they're able to add these units to offset some of their household costs, through rents. So what we need to do is ask ourselves, who's this for, and then calibrate it to their needs and resources available to them. So we're looking at, we add, and then if we go to the next slide, so this is invisible density, and it's increasing housing choice, and it's created by local homeowners. So it's given them a chance to contribute to any, affordability concerns.
And Neil, maybe to point out, as we were looking for new solutions to your challenge of housing choice, what we learned was the existing examples of properties where people were already solving the problem by adding a suite, by adding a cottage over time. This is a strategy we recommend in other places, and in South Tucson, people have already been doing this, but it is not legal. when they did it, it might have been legal before zoning, but today it's not legal. So in trying to figure out what to recommend for the future, we found that you had already figured this out and just need to be reminded and need to make it legal again so that people can have the option to add a suite that's attached or add a cottage or two. So this is what we discovered as we were looking for those solutions.
Yeah, so the aerial that I'm using here is from South Tucson. I just happened to find this block, which offered a really great example. So we're just picking up on what already exists in your community and saying, you know, this is working. It worked in the past, and let's make sure that it can work into the future. You can kind of see there are some zoning issues that would prohibit this. I think that, you know, in your lower density zones, you would run against the maximum lot coverage allowances. I think some setbacks would come into play here. And also in the ADU regulation, I think your ADU can only be 50% of the main house, but I'm finding that a lot of the main houses are only maybe 900 square feet. And so that limits the size of any cottage. So, you know, it's limiting that to about 400 square feet, which may work for some folks, but the opportunity to go a little bit larger would probably be useful in some of these backyard cottages. And then the other strategy that we're suggesting is this opportunity to maybe take some of these lots that are 50 by 150, 135, and have the ability to split them up. Currently, there's some minimum lot sizes restrictions at 6,500 square feet. So that creates a scenario where that 6,500 foot minimum lot size creates a scenario where there's a threshold to entry. So you have to be able to afford to buy a 6,500 square foot lot. The ability to subdivide those lots and create smaller lots reduces that land cost and therefore potentially reduces future rent and future sales prices. All right, so we want to have that opportunity to create smaller lots and smaller units.
And to point out, you may not be familiar with things like minimum lot size, but it is a standard part of zoning where the regulations govern what size a lot can be so that you can build on it and whether you're able to subdivide and have another building built on it. So these are things you don't normally encounter, but if you are an existing resident in South Tucson and development pressure is building up around you, these are strategies that you might want to be able to take advantage of. And so the question is, does the zoning regulation allow it? So we are digging really deep in our spot test into things that most folks barely know exist to find those barriers and highlight them for you to say, for existing property owners, if they would like additional income opportunities from their own property, or the ability to, you know, develop in ways that others down the street have done it, we need to adjust these parts of the zoning code.
And if we go to the next slide, this is probably your business as usual, you know, in the lower end of the SR1 zone. This is business as usual in 75% of your residential areas. And we know that, as Brian mentioned earlier, that you know, a fifth of those properties are non-conforming, and so they're not able to do anything without special permission. Fortunately, we've heard from locals that, you know, your planning department finds ways to yes and is willing to work with folks, and so that's good. But you know, these little additions, right? So there's all this land, so this creates a certain threshold of cost, but you can see how much extra space. So there's, you know, I think the limitation is 33% lot coverage on, you know, so that constricts to a fairly small house and it leaves a lot of space in the back. And when you have development pressure, without having the ability to incrementally add pieces here and there and respond to the market, what will happen over time, we believe, is as development pressure grows, without the ability to add incrementally, you run into a position where down the road, this turns into a scenario where you get tear downs, right? So the development pressure is so great that your land costs are increasing, and then somebody comes and buys that property, tears down the house, and builds a much larger house to get the price that they need out of it. And then it starts to turn into a scenario where you're getting something different, a big jump in your socioeconomic composition, right?
So the
So
insight that
go
we
ahead.
had was to make available options for local folks who are, before the development pressure becomes too great, right? Making options for them to get involved in the real estate opportunities, adding a cottage or a suite, allows them then to be positioned to take advantage or be in control in the future, rather than nothing happening, and then all of a sudden the development pressure becomes so great that it becomes cost effective for other people to buy the property and to do a tear down. You're not in the tear down economics yet, but if South Tucson continues to have development pressures, you will be. And so the strategy now is to allow locals incremental opportunities for adding suites and cottages, casitas, et cetera, so that they are able to in the development, take advantage of development opportunities, right? That was a pretty big insight. And it reacted against the fear that many folks were describing, which was, gentrification and displacement. This is an anti-displacement strategy, allowing folks to create revenue generating small buildings.
Absolutely.
Next slide.
Yes.
So we looked at the single family zoning on the left in blue. We also saw that your multifamily, anything more than single family, right, duplexes on up, that missing middle and larger, is in the light blue, and it's very concentrated, right? And then separate still in the orange and red and yellow are your commercial, your retail zoning. And what this showed us was that since 1978, that imposed these categories, South Tucson is very, in some ways, segregated by building type. Whereas prior to the zoning, you would see a much more diverse mix of buildings all throughout South Tucson. You wouldn't see these kind of monoculture crops of single family homes and then multi apartment buildings and then retail. This is a very segregated set of land uses that if you walk around and see older buildings, the older buildings didn't follow this segregation. They were much more diverse. So we described the original form of South Tucson as your original DNA. And the current zoning is kind of like a GMO, right? What's allowed to be built today is very specific and very limited in place. What we're suggesting is that diversifying your building types to give more housing choice and more building choices of different affordability, of different sizes and compositions, right? To make more diverse than what is being generated now. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but by design, your zoning is producing single family homes in dark blue that kind of look like this, producing apartment buildings that kind of look like this, and retail opportunities that kind of look like this, most of which fall into not the local development opportunity, right? But for the industry focused corporate and institutional money. So by design, the zoning that you have is leaving out local folks from participating in residential, multifamily and commercial buildings, and making it only mostly the only kind of development that you have is outside developers doing this kind of stuff because this is what your zoning code is directing them to do. So that was an insight that we had from these conversations and this analysis. So that's what we learned. What we'd like to talk about with you now is what next. And have a bit of a brainstorm about what are the top issues and opportunities that all of this raises for you. And I'm going to take a quick look at the chat to see if some of those questions, if we should answer the questions or if it's going to lead into the next set of conversation, because I can only do, unfortunately, one thing at a time. But while I'm doing that, maybe you could all think about, you know, what is it that you most care about from any of this? What problems did you come to this presentation wanting to address with small scale development? And we'll talk together about what are the next steps that you can take going forward. So quick review of the, I could probably stop sharing my screen, look at the chat, if we need to address some of these questions. World War II, yes, got it. Okay, so the questions were not there. So folks, let's just hear from random folks. What are the issues that you were hoping to address with small scale development? What brought you here? Just random quick thoughts. Anybody?
Paul Diaz, what brought me here was the fact that there's quite a few lots, triangular lots along the railroad track that are not owned by, I guess, anybody, but they are small lots for small homes if the zoning changed. There's also there's about 3 more lots at the end of 33rd where the cul-de-sac was put up and missed those 3 lots down at the end. And of course, those could be developed as a cul-de-sac was extended into there. But mostly it's the fact that the 6,500 square feet limit that we have needs to be changed to include the mini homes or the new type of homes that could be built for smaller families instead of large families. And there's a few of those around, but again, we need not architectural drawings for these type of things. We need something that's could be within the realm of small houses, you know, either already featured someplace else that we could use instead of adding that to the cost of building. So that's 2 of the problems that I have is the fact that the zoning code requires all this additional added financial stress for the small homeowners or the people that really want to, and not the investors. You know, they could care less, I guess, some of them. But you know, it's really hard. It's a hardship on the rest of us. So the corner lots and the financial stress is my big concern.
Okay, so I'm also hearing, you know, looking at vacant lots, figuring out what opportunities there are to change the zoning to enable smaller buildings, smaller and different kinds of family sizes, and opportunities for small developers. What else for other folks? What are some other issues that you're trying to advance through the use of encouraging small scale development?
Hi, my name is Shreya Jimenez. I've been working, actually, Paul Diaz introduced me to some homeowners who have zoning violations. So for me, I'm also, with the city of Tucson, we're working on, I actually got a large grant to try to push this issue forward with the ADUs and getting them legalized. And we're trying to create a program where we can help provide some technical assistance to homeowners and, you know, either through helping them with the plan, you know, getting through procurement or even through the technical assistance with, construction, just getting them lists of GCs and, local contractors and all that type of stuff. So, so I'm interested in a similar type of thing in South Tucson where, and what we've talked about with the city of Tucson so far is that we also need an amnesty period where people can get into conformance, and that needs to be several years because just getting a survey and hiring a drafts person can take anywhere from, at a minimum 3 to 6 months. Depending on it, all of this takes time and money, and then as Paul is mentioning, it does take a lot of technical expertise to build anything, if you want to get permits and do it legally. So then how do we, again, I have a little bit of grant funding to maybe help offset some of those costs, but one other idea we've talked about is getting pre-approved plans maybe for some of these small houses and dwellings and additions. But I'm basically, interested in kind of sharing whatever work I'm currently doing with the city of Tucson and sharing that with South Tucson. But it's the same set of issues. The minimum lot sizes are a challenge. Basically the density, where we've set the density in Tucson, we've outgrown, and I think this city and city of South Tucson both could benefit from increased density. And similar issues that you've already all brought up.
Great. So it sounds like your experience in Tucson could be really valuable for South Tucson as well. You're already doing this. What other issues are folks wanting to advance or opportunities are they trying to create?
I've been a little bit concerned. This is Bob Tissel. A big concern because of the COVID virus and things like that. And we got so many houses packed into a lot, that I'm not sure that doesn't cause bigger health problems or potential health problems if something like the virus should come back again. So in a sense, I think, we almost have to have more space between housing or between people, common spaces, things like that, that people share. It's just serious. I know that, people stayed inside their houses here. I think probably a lot more than say people up in Marana or other places. They seem to move around a little bit, but the streets were empty here. So that's a big concern of mine.
Okay.
Particular people, yeah. Not the typical thing you're thinking about when you're doing planning, I think, but potentially, that might be something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, trying to figure out what we learned from this pandemic and what implications there are for building going forward. Sure. What else are folks trying to accomplish? I can't see if Ian's on the call, but one of the things that I was doing before joining Incremental Development Alliance several years ago was helping the city of Albuquerque plan for its bus rapid transit line and looking at the opportunities for local folks to benefit from the development opportunities that transit improvement would make. You in South Tucson have the same opportunity. The 6th Street rapid transit line is being planned right now. There's a large federal planning grant. But it is an opportunity to look deeper at not only the commercial properties, which we only touched on, right? We did a market analysis and we did one live work analysis. There's more detail to understand about your station areas. But the question is, who can develop there? Now is exactly the right time for small developers like Selena and Shay to look at those station areas, because eventually when plans get made, larger developers are going to take notice and they're going to be able to move on those opportunities. So that's another thing that some folks could take a look at, and working with the planners, Ian and others on that. I don't know if anybody else in the call is involved in that. That's a really great opportunity early on before the whole world learns what's going to happen there. I'll share a slide and we can keep talking. Interested to see if this sparks any thoughts about anybody being interested. Toggle mine. But again, please jump in. Other thoughts, other things. What's most important to you about any of this? As I try to share my screen.
I'd like to find a way of getting some of this property back into the hands of owners, have ownership, not necessarily rentals. A lot of our properties are, I think something like 70% or maybe even more than that are non-owner occupied. So I think things would be a lot better for us if we could, for the entire city of South Tucson, if we could get the properties back into the hands of people who own their properties.
Okay, and in some ways, Shay and Selena, you are trying to do that, right? Local small developers. Are there folks, do you know other small developers, other rehabbers, other people that are doing this kind of work locally that you could connect to the boot camp folks? What happens in other places is a group of small developers starts talking maybe monthly. They get together, maybe after work or for drinks, and they talk about what are they learning, what properties are they looking at, who's doing what. I'm wondering, does anybody besides Shay and Selena know people who are already doing rehabs that you can connect them with? Because in some ways, you got to build your way out of your current situation, right? You got to find people who are going to build. Right now, it's on the backs of Shay and Selena. But there are people that are doing it. And one strategy might be to use word of mouth. And a lot of you talked about in our focus groups, restaurants who are adding on and small businesses who are adding on. I mean, those are small developers as well, even though you don't think of them as small developers, right? A restaurant adding on. So maybe broaden your thinking about who's doing development and start talking with each other. What are they running into? What opportunities do they see? What else for folks? Do any of these things on the left suggest something that you're interested in? Because some of you talked about making legal what you have, right? That was Shay. Your own small developers, I keep talking about that. The equitable TOD corridor, mentioned that. What about, is anybody on this call interested in wealth building and growing income from existing buildings?
Well, we're definitely interested in revenue. I mean, we don't have enough revenue to maintain ourselves right now, city as a whole. So, anything we've thought about, what we can do maybe in the areas up by, from the freeway on the south, through the Greyhound Park, areas like that, because we just don't raise enough revenue to keep us sustainable. 3 years ago, I think we're basically in a process of shutting down had we not made some drastic changes to our budgets and things like that to start saving. We didn't we didn't, our fire department is not sustainable at the moment. Our police force is underemployed. We don't have enough police officers.
Yeah.
We can't do that until we raise some revenue.
Great. So Neil just did an analysis in the city of South Bend, Indiana, about this very question. Would it be worth describing, maybe tailoring the idea to what South Tucson could look at? Because it is a question of how much local property tax revenue can be generated by small scale developers.
Yeah, I think Roberto, what you mentioned is hugely important. And I think that, so I did this analysis and Incremental Development Alliance worked in South Bend, Indiana, worked with their planners to update their zoning code. There are sections of town in South Bend close to the university that see all the development activity. And that's because, they can achieve the rents required for the students, for the student housing. There's a section of town right across the river that hadn't seen development in 40 years. And this is an area with high vacancy, high number of vacant parcels.
Right.
And when I look around South Tucson, I see a similar condition where I see a lot of vacant parcels. And so this process of calibrating and finding out what is more immediately implementable by local folks has the potential to bring those properties back online and put them back on the tax rolls, and do it in a way that is higher value on a per acre basis.
Right.
And so when we did that, the analysis in South Bend, there's a small developer working in that neighborhood who is doing the first bit of development they've seen in 40 years in that neighborhood. And he has been at it for 5 years. In the end, he will have developed 50 units of residential and a fair amount of commercial in this neighborhood over time, right? So he's got 50 scattered sites that he'll be developing. So the analysis was to say, well, your typical approach, real estate development approach, might be to do something larger, a heavily subsidized project that does 50 units all at once, and call it, a catalyst project. So this market-driven small developer approach ended up resulting in more affordability, because the zoning opened up and it wasn't just single families anymore. Now he's building duplexes. He's building tiny homes that are affordable that he's selling for $160,000, $150,000. That's for South Bend, that's hugely affordable. 4plexes, 12plexes. There's a whole range of unit types that he can do. And it works out to actually produce similar amounts of revenue, but it does not require any sort of investment from the city, or limited investment from the city. Maybe some upgrades to pavement or sidewalks, things like that. What I can do is try to pull up the snapshot of the development outcome. And so while I'm looking for that, Brian, if you've got anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, so it isn't just one guy, though. He started in a boot camp. He started with rehabs. He did a couple of Habitat homes with Habitat, just like you guys have Habitat. And then neighbors he found were already doing rehabs, so they started joining him. He gets them together monthly. He was the guy that I was thinking about drinks after work once a month, sharing their stories with each other. A local pastor and his wife are now doing small development. So there's probably about a dozen people in a neighborhood, maybe quarter the size of South Tucson, where these 50 buildings are going to take shape in about 5-6 year period, right? And generating, Neil will show how much new tax revenue to the city of South Bend, and costing much less than a typical 50 unit project. So they generate more tax revenue, they take less money or no money to subsidize, and it's being done by about a dozen local boot camp and other folks. Yeah,
This is Paul Diaz again. I do understand what you're saying, but we also have a problem of gentrification. And that's because of the developers that are coming in and buying these older homes. So when they come up with a sale, it's usually not the people that lived here before.
Yeah.
So our demographic is changing drastically because of this. These developers are taking anything from people that are losing their homes due to back taxes. The buy those up and make them, above our range. The houses now have jumped to over 200,000 in the city of South Tucson. So these rehab homes are quite expensive, even for us to stay here. I know that my particular home here has the value, at least what they're offering, and I get those offers about 3 times a week from different developers or from different people purchasing ugly homes. So that's my concern, is this gentrification, I guess.
Yeah, so two things. One, in South Bend, those dozen small developers are all from the neighborhood. So that's what, there's an alternate model that we're teaching in the boot camp, is to grow your own. So I don't know if Shay or Selena want to say anything about what you're seeing in the boot camp, but you are locals. You live here. And if you were to develop properties, that would be a different model than the speculator coming in from the outside. Anything to say about that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, part of what I'm interested in doing is trying to teach people exactly this, is to learn about the value of, their homes and equity and how things work, and maybe potentially we can find homeowners who maybe are low, we say cash poor but house rich. There may be some out there who maybe they've already paid off their mortgage and they have some equity, significant equity. Maybe they don't have a lot of cash on hand, but maybe they could pull off some of these renovations themselves. So I think it's just going to take, as it's already starting to happen naturally for me, people are reaching out and learning about the projects I've been working on. And I'm hoping to find more of those people, and then we're tracking their stories, and then going to be able to share them so that other people can learn from the process and learn how to go through the steps. So yeah, I definitely hope we can find folks, who are able, or if we have to. I think it's going to be tough for some of the low income homeowners or renters. I think at a certain level, you do just need the subsidy. And I know there's other people working in South Tucson who are looking into LIHTC and some of the other models, that exist out there for the lower income folks. But I think for the, middle class, I think there's some options out there with this stuff, with this incremental development. And I think for, as long as people are employed and they have a job and have some access to credit, it's possible, it is.
So it sounds like Paul and you should have a conversation if you guys aren't already talking, because Shay, you're doing what exactly the kind of stuff that we would imagine would be the next steps. Neil and I looked at.
Can I say something?
Please.
In the last 30 years and stuff, what we've been seeing in South Tucson is that the owners, the 29% of the owners that have stayed in South Tucson have settled as far as, becoming retirees. So they're on fixed income.
Right.
So yeah, they're sitting on a home that probably have owned by a couple of generations, but they're on fixed income and stuff. So there's the banks and don't see them the same way as, as to provide fundings for them. And then another thing that we've been seeing, and, and I work with the Primavera Foundation, so we see a lot of this happening already, is that people that do the appraising of our homes, if they see that it's a Latino that owns the home, your appraisal comes way down. If it's a white person that owns the home, the appraiser goes up. So
I think you cut out. So sounds like those are two issues that could be worked on, and Shay's starting to touch some of those. But the question of folks who are retirees on fixed incomes, whether banks are seeing them as able to be, borrowers to build a suite, an attached suite, or a cottage, or a casita. And Shay, it sounds like you're starting to address that, and you're learning some stuff. We had a conversation that Ryan organized with regional lenders, and he got the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco to help convene those bankers. But that's a conversation that they'd be willing to have a next conversation. So
Yeah, and I think what Alonso brings up is also what my suspicion is as well, because the urbanism down here is very different. It's, you know, the homeowner I'm working with now, he has built incrementally, he's built it all on cash, he's built it all himself. So it's this very ad hoc type of construction, but it's very barrio. To me, it's very much reflective of the culture and the spirit of place, and it's also what makes South Tucson so unique. And so, but it's devalued. I could totally see an assessor coming in and not valuing it at the same as a conventional suburban property, because they do things that are just not typical, you know, what people want to, but it doesn't mean that they're not beautiful. It's just different. And so I think there is some education that's going to need to take place with appraisals, because when I went through and looked at it from the perspective of an architect, I thought it was constructed very well, you know, and I thought, you know, I would, but my guess is that a lot of these properties that have been built this way and have been built out, because he's pretty much maxed out his lot, and a lot of other people around the area have already, they may not come in with the appraisal that they need, either because they have the zoning violations or because, you know, they just don't look like typical American developments. So there is going to be, I believe, a lot of this that we're still facing today, you know, which is kind of institutional, you know.
Yeah, Shay, you bring up a really good point, and that was something that I had said in our conversations internally. When I was looking around on Google Maps, you know, I was seeing a built environment that was different than the zoning code that I was looking at. You know, the zoning code that I was looking at felt like a very Anglo sort of imposition, but the built environment and the folks that we had been talking with did not, there was a mismatch. And so I think that getting back to some of those diagrams that we were showing, you know, with the guest suite, cottage here and there, and, you know, maybe there's a big awning. And so maybe the living spaces are smaller, but because of your climate and you've got the awning, you know, there's a lot more outdoor space that can be used so that you get some outdoor living, and that's super cheap space. So maybe you can build 500 square feet, 600 square feet, but you've got a large outdoor space, and so it kind of makes it live like 1,000, 1,200 square foot unit. Yeah. And I think, you know, because of your climate and the cultural conditions, I think that works out well to create affordable spaces in taking advantage of that cheap outdoor space.
Yep, that's exactly what people do. They pave, they put a patio, they shade the ramada, they put the ramada on the west side, so you're shading the hottest side. I mean, it's all very sensitively done to our culture and to our climate, but it doesn't, and the outdoor kitchens, again, the resident I visited had this amazing outdoor kitchen and these amazing outdoor spaces, but the you know, the footprint of the building, the little casita he built for him and his wife was small. I mean, it was, yeah, probably less than 500 square feet. And then he's renting the main house in the front to his family for like the cost of utilities. So again, these are like really affordable ways people are already working and already operating. And I think we just, again, we videoed him, we got his story. We're gonna start broadcasting soon because we wanna, you know, be able to share with people that this is already in existence. People are already doing it. And we just need to just show others, you know, this is how you can do it. And, you know, and there's still ways to build affordably. Again, a lot of people in the South Side either are connected to the building trades, have family members in the building trades. I mean, it is very, you know, I grew up in the South Side. So for me, I grew up seeing construction happen in this way where it was very informal. It was, you know, in people's spare time, you know, so there's lots of ways people find to cut down on construction costs when they're doing it themselves.
Yeah. So Neil, what if we shift to the deck? What I'm wondering now is we've raised a number of issues that really could be worked on, and you have zoning opportunities coming up with your comprehensive plan. So I'm interested to maybe know, with what you've already talked about, changing zoning to allow to make legal what works for people like you just described. There's an opportunity to do that. Can we, I'm going to share my screen, just that last.
So what I was showing there real quick though was just as these properties came back online, the amount of revenue increased a positive 2,334%. Like, you know, those are video game numbers. It's even hard to kind of understand, but it goes from a value of, you know, a taxable value of these empty lots of 66,000 per acre up to almost $5 million per acre. So you know, this is showing the value in small scale development when it's done on an aggregated basis. So, you know, the individual duplex or the individual tiny house might not seem like much, but I think when you get it across a broader area, it really starts to add up. And the value there is not, there is value in taxable revenue, but there's also value in their social benefits, like affordable home ownership. There is, you know, he was able to get these privately provided rent ranges way down, you know, 50 to 90% AMI, which is something that subsidized affordable housing folks do, but he was able to do that privately provided. So that was kind of the point there, that, you know, we can win on the social side, but we can also win on the municipal side and pay for fire, pay for social services. So that was the.
Can you unshare?
Oh, sorry. Yep.
So with what you've talked about, I'm interested, just kind of, maybe we could do a show of hands here in the chat of.
I think it'd be an interesting sort of analysis to take that Walgreens downtown or on 6th, you know, and compare that on a taxable value per acre. A way to compare things of different sizes. And I think we would see that, you know, a live work with some local makers in a commercial space and a little residential unit in the back might produce more value on a per acre basis than maybe even, you know, a large Walgreens, because they take up so much space. And with a town that's only 1 mile by 1 mile wide, you know, you got to think about what you're growing like a farmer, right? You have to be cognizant of how you, and diligent about the space that you use and produce the most amount of value for it.
Okay, so you guys can see the screen, right? There are 4 topics that have come up, maybe additional ones, but I'm wondering if you could share 1 through 4. Are any of these something that you are interested in some way? So Shay, you talked about small developers. You're in the boot camp, you're an architect, you're doing small development, you're talking to people who are getting tradespeople and people are adding on to their homes who are essentially small developers. I wonder who's interested in that mix of stuff, either finding more small developers, working with people like Shay. If you could put a 1 in the chat, if that's a set of issues that you're interested in. Neil and Roberto were talking about the tax revenue that comes from the small development. So maybe, you know, you put a 1 in because you're interested in helping generate the tax revenue, or maybe it's you want to make the case to City Hall that some of these small developments do need some additional help because we give them to the big developers. That was another issue that South Bend was dealing with, or the appraising, right? They dealt with the appraisal. So best often done through working with the small developers who are experiencing directly those things. So you may not be a small developer, but if you care about appraisals, loans, or tax revenue, that's a conversation you could have with them. Then a bunch of you have talked about making legal what isn't legal, but that works and that you love and that was legal in the past. So that maybe be a 2. I mentioned that the comp plan is being redone and the zoning could be looked at as part of that. Cities also change zoning in an ad hoc way, you know. If that is something you're interested in, throw a 2 in the chat. I think, when Shay described her work, working with existing folks and helping them see what they can add on, seeing what they add on and seeing how they finance it, friends and family, lower labor costs of, there's a whole economy of bootstrapping entrepreneurial folks who've been doing this stuff. That would be an issue around number 3. Maybe there's some opportunities to learn what works, so you can go to city council and say, we want to change this zoning because these 15 families over the last 10 years have done things that are really good. We want to make it easier for the next 15. So learning and telling those stories, listening to the videos and the recordings that Shay's putting together, that might be all conversations related to number 3. And then I mentioned 6th Street. I don't know if anybody else is the equitable TOD. They are looking to be equitable, which is not how federal transportation dollars always get sent out. But now they got a grant to make the development equitable. So if you're concerned about gentrification, displacement, or on the flip side, opportunity wealth building in the 6th Street corridor, where values are going to go up on commercial property, and getting folks in locally from on the ground floor, throw a number 4 in there. And is there anything that you didn't hear that you're still interested in? So another topic that anybody else wants to throw out that other folks should hear in case somebody wants to join you? Or did we cover it all?
I had invited some other, some family members I have who actually have their own property in South Tucson. And one of them is a vacant lot that they're just sitting on. And what they've found is that, yeah, right now it's tough with the construction costs to make any kind of new construction, same as you guys found. But the other thing is that there's also there's no incentive on the city side. And it doesn't have to be any kind of subsidy that's dollars. It could be, people find ways to create development incentives through zoning, for example, density bonuses or upzoning or, parking waivers, or maybe there's other ways to get at reducing some of those costs, development costs, that wouldn't necessarily cost the city money, but could be done in other ways. So that's one point I wanted to bring up. And then the second one is that they also, right now, the way they're working, they work with hard money because they can't find people to lend them in this range, which is pretty much from between a 5-plex and an apartment building. There's a huge gap with financing where it's really tough to find a loan. And what they do is they go in with hard money and then they refinance within 2 to 3 years into a conventional mortgage. And that's just to get property acquisition, just to move in, get it fast, get it secured, and then they'll, and again, and this is just and they're operating at a larger scale than I am right now. And so they have, they're buying up a lot of these parcels and projects that have the zoning issues where, again, they're not appraising as high as they should because they've got, a bunch of illegal units on them or, whatever the case may be. So, it's a challenge. I think that this is going to be a challenge. And I think that the financing is another piece where, something Ryan and I have kicked around is is there a way we could get some of the IDAs to create some kind of revolving loan fund or some way that we could get more access to cheaper capital for folks at this scale?
Yeah.
Can I say something? Primavera, we're developing a single family home. We've built 5 homes in the last 2 years. And so our construction person went to the city of Tucson thinking she didn't know the difference between the city of South Tucson and city of Tucson. So city of Tucson is taking 3 to 4 months to get your permits. So she came back, she goes, well, it's gonna take 3 or 4 months to get the permits and stuff. And so we knew right away that she was in the, she went to the wrong place. So I called up Mick and then Durazo, who is our guy that does the permits and stuff. And they told me, both of them told me, yeah, you probably can get it within a week. So that's one of the advantages of building in South Tucson. So.
Excellent, excellent. So we only have a couple minutes left. We said we would go for an hour and a half. You'll have access to this video and the chat, and you can see who's interested in what. One of the things that we say in the boot camp to the small developers is that nobody's coming to save you. If you're going to change your community, it's not going to be somebody else coming in from the outside. It's up to you. We've talked about, and you've raised a number of issues. And the question is, what do you do next? So, and you know, each of you may care about different things. How do you find some folks and start moving on the next thing? We talk also in the boot camp about what's the very next thing that you can do tomorrow to move the ball forward on your issue or your development. And these 4 topics seem to be places where there's energy. What do you want to do about it? In another place, we're working across the country. Last week, we did this same session at the end of our 6 months in Vermont, and they decided to hold a meeting to talk among themselves 3 weeks later. So I would just invite you to think about, what do you guys want to do next, and who do you want to do it with? You have this video. You'll see who's on the list. Ryan and Mick have a list of everybody else who's participated in the other pieces. What is one thing you could see doing in the next month to take the next step?
I think these are what I see right now. I mean, I know we talked about it earlier, but you know, you mentioned people that work in the businesses out there, developers. I don't want to call them developers. I'm talking about construction people. You know, I've got people next door that do landscaping, another painter, house painter, things like that. He lives next door. We got I got some cousins a block away that you know, do just about any kind of construction. I think Alfonso was talking about the people that he knows that they've hired as their contractors to build some of these houses. I don't think they're big time contractors. They just do a few houses here and there type of a thing. But we can maybe form some kind of a coalition or something. Put together some kind of a directory of, you know, where people can call local people to see what they can get, services that they need. We are a service community one way or another. You know, I know that the people here just basically they go everywhere. You know, they may not work here in South Tucson necessarily. They probably work for a general contractor or something somewhere else, but come the weekends, they're out here working on other projects, you know, on their own. You know, I don't know if it's legal or not legal, but they are definitely out there and striving to make a better life for themselves.
So it sounds like you know a bunch of people who might want to be developers or might want to work on development projects, bring those costs down with their local rates.
Right.
Are the developers getting together and at all?
Right.
Is that what you guys talked about? Because everybody can invite people they know to the next time you guys are getting together, if you are getting together.
Sure.
We're not at this point. I mean, I think with COVID, everyone's still kind of like figuring it out, but yeah, we've talked about it. I think we want to, you know, just hasn't happened yet.
Right.
One thing you could do is, Ryan or Mick, you could share a list of everybody who's participated with everybody who's participated. That way you would all know each other, right? So when you can get back together, you know who to call. That would be one thing. Any other thoughts about, for example, if zoning conversations were wanting to happen, is there anything that's coming up that folks could get involved in, or does that need to be created? I'm thinking about either your comp plan or your consolidated plan for HUD. Every 5 years, you put together a plan for HUD about how you're going to use your block grant money. Some of that money is used for affordable housing, and that needs to be redone at some point. Might be an opportunity for some of you to suggest how that money, like perhaps a revolving loan fund that you described, or other assistance, that would be an opportunity.
Yeah, I think we're going to be working on our HUD plan right here pretty quick. We're
Who would
in the middle of that.
contact?
What's that?
Who would people contact if they were interested in that plan? You?
They would contact Betty Villegas at the
Isn't it Betty now? Yeah.
City of South Tucson.
Betty
Alright.
Vegas just became the new housing director.
Okay. So we will we'll send the link with the list of everybody. We'll make sure that that link is included to these documents. These documents are dense and detailed. But you know, if you need the case to be able to make it to city council or somebody else, you know, there's detail in there. And there are other folks who've done pieces of this in other places that the boot camp folks have access to, or send us an email if you're interested in finding out, well, who's dealt with appraisal gaps, who's dealt with, you know, and we often can refer you to someone who's already done it. And it sounds like there's pieces that people are already doing. Shay, you know, described a lot of stuff that you're doing. So reconnect locally too, to the folks that you heard. That's it for us. We'll share those things and make sure you have access to them, and we will we'll be watching to see what happens with what you guys can do. We think there's, you know, it's a beginning, right? We often work for longer time in a community and looking at more detail and other opportunities. So if that's something that you're interested in, we can tell you what we've done other places, but we can also put you in touch with people like you who've been doing it. So maybe that helps too. And you can share some of what you're learning with them.
Thank you, Brian and Neil. That was a really great presentation, and it's been a fruitful relationship over the last few months working on this project with you. Very much appreciated. I definitely would like to help City of South Tucson work on convening in the future. And as Brian was saying, we're going to get all of the documents will be publicly available, and we'll be hosting them on the City of South Tucson website if we can help that. And there'll also be links to recorded videos. So if there's anything that you want to be able to share, you should be able to do that. But thanks everybody for participating today. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks all.